It's February 2026. Russia's war against Ukraine is in its fourth year, and today we'll take another look at the military situation. I'm Julian Rupke, and this is BILD Situation Center. It's been 2 weeks since we last took a look at the military situation, and despite the harsh winter conditions, Russia has managed to push further forward at several points along the front, especially in the south, in the Zaporizhia region. We're looking at new propaganda videos from the Russian army which show us how here in the south, around the small town of Ternuvate, was being actively attacked for 2 or 3 weeks. We mainly see the drone superiority of the Russian army, which is being used against the remaining Ukrainian soldiers stationed there. And on the one hand, of course, the logistics being attacked again and again. So we see robots here, for instance, logistics robots, then of course vehicles and antennas being targeted as well. Of course, the Ukrainian soldiers who were there in their trenches simply trying to defend Ternuvate, a town here, we'll see it in a moment. Quite small, of course, only about 1,500 residents before the war, but with a fair amount of infrastructure. We have a railway line here, we have several industrial areas and of course residential areas in this town, and in that sense another small success for the Russians. However, a very peculiar success. We'll discuss that in more detail in a bit, because we're still not 100% sure if the Russians are actually present here. They moved in, advanced further from there as the Russian army claims, or if it was mainly a flag planting stunt, meaning they just brought several soldiers into the city, raised the flags there and then quickly withdrew. We'll continue watching the video in a moment, seeing the final combat scenes here before we get to those typical scenes. We've unfortunately seen Russians raise their flag again. Here we see it quite well, the city entrance sign of Ternuvate. I think even though it's Cyrillic, it's pretty easy to read here. And then the Russian flag being raised there. And the problem is why the Ukrainian version, that the whole thing was very brief, that it was just a flag stunt and they quickly withdrew again. Why this version is relatively unlikely is that we've actually geolocated the whole thing. And we see these soldiers here, for example, are standing in the absolute west of Ternuvate, behind the railway line running here and the large factory. And we are about to see more footage showing us that in all the districts, the Russians were able to move around quite freely. The flag over there could hoist it and film it all. We also keep seeing this wild behavior. That means the Russians are doing this on purpose so that we also have the chance to more or less verify the whole thing. And we can actually see that everywhere in Ternuvate people have lined themselves up in order to film the whole of the entire thing. The Ukrainians, as I said, claim they drove the Russians out shortly after and have retaken this town. However, we will take a look at all of that on the map in just a moment. It is relatively unlikely because the Russians have managed to capture another location close by. But as I said, we'll first take a look at all this on the map to understand the significance of Ternuvate and the neighboring villages. This time we've set it up so we look at it on January 19th at the time of a previous broadcast, and then the status today, meaning 2 weeks later, and we see Ternuvate. On January 19th, still relatively far from the front, so it's about 15 kilometers from here to the solid Russian occupied territory. We'll actually let the whole thing keep running right up to today. We see it up there, the status is changing, and here's the update. That means we now see, even according to Deep State Map, our pro-Ukrainian map provider, the combat zone is the orange-colored area has now reached the city. However, the one problem that we have just seen is that those Russian flags were not just raised right there on the outskirts in the south, but the very first video that we saw that was right here at the westernmost spot, in the city, as I said, the railway line goes down here towards Zalisnikne, and we saw afterwards how these videos were being posted all over the city, really to show everywhere that we've got the whole city. And there's another issue with the Ukrainian version. Specifically, we have another video that we'll look at in a moment. From the small suburb, actually a tiny village with about 10 houses plus, called Prudorozhne, and this suburb is located here, which means a bit further west-southwest of Ternuvate, and there we also have, we can take a look at that now basically. Videos from the Russian army showing us that the flag was raised there as well. And if that's the case, if the Russians only just managed to briefly raise their flag in Ternuvate and were then driven back out again by the Ukrainian army, as Kyiv claims, then it's simply quite unlikely that they moved further west from there and managed to pull it off over there after all. Here in the background, that's the relatively large town of Ternuvate, which we've just seen. And right here in the foreground, as we've seen, just a few villages, those are the Russian soldiers who are right here in Prudorozhne, basically performing their flag stunt once again, at the very least demonstrating to us that they are in possession of the village, even if it is an extremely small village. Another village too, a bit further south, near Hulyai, we'll take another look at that on the map in a second, was captured by the Russians according to their own reports, namely Svetopetrivka. Svetopetrivka, another small place, in this case a suburb of Hulyai. Here too Russian soldiers can be seen on the ground, and here too the drones constantly panning back and forth. Here we see the Russians with their flags coming out of the houses, and so we're already assuming, also based on our map, by the way, we've just seen it, that at least the orange area has shifted. That the Russian armies advanced further in the Zaporizhzhia region, pushing west. What not only operational but also tactical or maybe even strategic consequences this all has. We recall Russia annexed Zaporizhzhia completely in the fall of 2022 but didn't actually occupy it. What consequences that has, let's take another look at the map. First, once again, the difference between 2 weeks ago and now. We also see again very briefly what I want to show you, that third village we just saw earlier. That was just right down here. We have seen Svetopetrivka, we have seen Ternuvate, and we have also seen Pridorozhne. We now see how the front is changing, moving into the current and very up-to-the-minute area here, so to speak. And now we zoom out a bit further to see why it's extremely important for the Russians to advance here. So why they're pushing from the east towards Donetsk region, see it right there, very small. It's just the final. Few meters, few kilometers that we see behind this dashed line, why they're coming from the east. Pushing into Zaporizhzhia. There are two reasons for that. On the one hand, of course, it's about this tactical success you always get by being in the villages. We see it here, the last villages of recent months. We've marked them again, pushing further ahead. Hulyai was indeed the last small town actually captured here, now under Russian control. But that's only one aspect, simply wanting to advance further west. The other aspect is that if we look further at the situation here in the Zaporizhzhia region, we see that the Russians are also carrying out a huge, massive pincer movement right now. That would be after the loss of Hulyai. Only one town left, formerly 15,000 residents here in the south, Kharkiv, that's under Ukrainian control. And south of this town, the front has held extremely firm since 2022. That means the Russians have only advanced a few kilometers there. In between, the Ukrainians also advanced there, capturing this small village of Robotyne during their counteroffensive. That actually took months. Now we see that the Russians have once again opted for a plan B, that they're not advancing head-on from the south, but are instead trying to flank from the east. And we see this clearly when we also look at the western part. Here in Stepnohirsk, they're trying, after at least partially capturing the town, to push forward towards the northeast. Right here, they are trying to push forward towards the west. And all of this would, of course, once again end in a large semi-pocket, at least for Uriv and also for Komishuka as well. There's also another small town still right here, and that would be the worst-case scenario for the Ukrainians. So if you lose this whole major defense line down here, which is holding firm because the Russians are flanking once again because they're executing this pincer movement, and should it come to that, should the Russians manage to bring this area under control, then the next and the major goal for the Russians would naturally be in southern Ukraine, the attack on Zaporizhzhia city. We see that the Russians are now only 17 kilometers from the south. But for now, just here, the Ukrainians have a large buffer zone to defend the city of Zaporizhzhia. This is a very narrow axis of attack. We see these dotted lines on the left. That's the former Kharkovka reservoir, which has now been drained, but it's very difficult to actually launch an attack across it. In other words, we see the Russians have very big goals for these small villages, and also Ternovat, which has apparently now been captured. Ultimately, the goal is to also capture the city of Zaporizhzhia with its 700,000 residents and the region. Why? Why? Because Putin already annexed them 3 years ago. And it's not just in southern Ukraine that these flag games are being played. So Russia is using this flag raising to try and show we're very successful, we keep on advancing. We just said, in part apparently. Reflecting the facts, but Russia is also trying this in the northeast of Ukraine. And right here in the Kharkiv region, and here is a new video, or rather 2 new videos, which show us that this game just doesn't always work out. In this case, we don't have any flags here, but we have 2 Russian soldiers in a suburb of Kupiansk. It goes by the name Kupiansk-Vuslovyi. And in Kupiansk-Vuslovyi, the Russian army claims, according to their own reports and according to Chief of General Staff Gerasimov, they've already taken control. That means they've advanced here east of Kupiansk, pushed forward along the Oskil and just captured this town here. They want to prove all this, or wanted to prove it, with those soldiers just now. The problem for the Russians is that there are also Ukrainian soldiers in the city, showing right here with this large building in the background that we are here. In the city center, this city remains under our control. That means what Mr. Gerasimov is saying is just quite imaginative, to put it mildly. And here it was, just at least that's what it looks like, individual Russian soldiers who ventured into the city and also captured locatable footage there. However then, as we are now able to see in the footage here, they were taken prisoner by the Ukrainian soldiers. We'll see in a moment how the Ukrainian goes here. Of course, this is meant to show up the Russians a bit, to make the whole thing look a bit ridiculous. We have 2 Russian soldiers here who have been taken prisoner. And well, you've got to admit they're being shown here for propaganda purposes, both with their helmets on, as well as their vests, and even with their assault rifles still in hand. I don't know if you see that. I think you see it clearly here. Down at the bottom you see it, the soldier even has his assault rifle. He's definitely got no ammo left in there. And the message from Ukraine is, well, relatively clear. If this is indeed actually under your control, if you are controlling this city, how can it be that we are walking around here without a helmet, without a rifle, and without a bulletproof vest, while you yourselves are walking around in your full combat gear? Why? The answer is pretty clear. There are only a few Russian soldiers who have entered the city. These so-called sabotage and reconnaissance groups and the Ukrainian army, which controlling this suburb of Kupiansk. We're looking at the whole thing on the map and want to understand why Russia is so keen here as well to keep showing, yeah, we're already there, we're already very close by. Because it is actually all about this highly strategic pocket that is still situated right here on the eastern bank of the Oskil River. We'll zoom in even more in a moment. The Oskil, yeah, this frontline river, we remember the Russians had started this, well, complicated or even very daring flanking maneuver up here. So they tried to capture Kupiansk and with it access to the east bank of the Oskil. To block it. That was not successful. They were repelled there. Kupiansk, as we see here, is over 90% under Ukrainian control. And now the Russians are trying to push in from the east. This means we see these troops getting closer from the east, coming from the direction of Luhansk, moving further in and trying to reach the Oskil River. However, we have just been looking at the footage from Kupiansk-Wuslowi, so this footage right here, and we see that, yeah, it is very close to the Oskil River. The Russians really want to have captured this just so they can say, yeah, we're already right at Kupiansk, this city here. We see it's located on both sides of the Oskil, which means on both the eastern and the western bank. However, and we've just seen that quite clearly from the footage, it's just not the Russian army that has advanced here, but rather individual soldiers who were sent in order to record this propaganda, and some of whom were even killed or captured by the Ukrainians shortly thereafter. All in all, even though we keep seeing footage of Russian soldiers staying there in these other villages like Podoli, for instance, or Petropavlovka, they seem to be relatively small groups who don't actually have full control there overall, but keep sneaking back in to capture these recordings. Which, however, then leads to the Russian General Staff being able to openly claim to Putin that everything is under our control, and they've been claiming for months that the situation in Kupiansk is completely wrong, the situation is. Great for Russia. After Zaporizhia in the south and Kharkiv in the northeast. Let's also look at Donetsk in the east. There's still ongoing fighting around Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk itself is already mostly under Russian control, but the Russians are also currently trying to push forward north of it right now, and that's working to some extent. But sometimes it also ends in disaster. We're watching a last-second rescue carried out by the Ukrainian army. We see a relatively large group of Russian soldiers here who, or at least that's how it's told in these videos make it clear, who have actually taken prisoners, specifically 4 Ukrainians. So we can see quite clearly from the Russian flags here that this is this large group of Russian soldiers who are in this very wintry environment, also currently minus 25 degrees there, who pushed forward, who supposedly overran a Ukrainian position, captured 4 Ukrainians here, and what happened next? Well, like I said, a last-second rescue is something neither Russians nor Ukrainians here would have expected. You see, the Ukrainians now have absolute air superiority here. They are now attacking every single Russian soldier here with drones. And that supposedly results in, at least that's how the Ukrainian army has communicated it here, that the 4 Ukrainians basically used this chaos in the heat of battle. The Russians all headed for safety. Because of the uniforms, the Ukrainian pilots naturally knew exactly who they had to attack and who they didn't. And the Ukrainians then all managed to escape, at least according to the Ukrainian army's info. Every Russian, every one of these nearly 10 soldiers here was just targeted and attacked. And then we see how the Ukrainians managed to do it because they didn't really have to take cover, so to speak, because they could just keep on running to get away from there and then make it back through to their own lines again. The situation in Pokrovsk, let's look at it on the map, hasn't really changed much though, as I just said. We still have the situation where about 90% of the city is under Russian control. We also have the situation where the Russians further in Rodinsk in the north, we should zoom in a bit more now exactly, in Rodinsk in the north are trying to fully gain a foothold to capture the city. We can see here as well, about 50 to 60% of the city under Russian control, and also to gain a foothold in Rishine. However, with everything we've seen here, time and again, Russian soldiers in the city center, Russian soldiers moving along these lakes, I hope you can see them here, along these small lakes, pushing further into the center. All of that does not seem to have led to the Russians taking complete control right here. That means whenever we see from the Ukrainian side how the Russian soldiers are advancing here, how they're being attacked, but then we don't see any flag videos and especially don't see the Russians active even further north from there, then it is a very good indication that all of the Russian soldiers we saw in the videos were killed here and simply did not make it to take over this town. So the situation at Pokrovsk remains difficult for the Ukrainians. I think the battle for the city itself and also for the neighboring town of Mirnohrad is over by now. Looking at our deep state map right here, about 90% is solid red. 10% in the north of the city is still somewhat contested. We also know from the soldiers we spoke to back then, they have made it out. So they and their units managed to escape this pocket in time. However, it is possible, at least that's what the map shows, that some individual Ukrainian units are still holding out there so that the Russians cannot push any further northwestwards away from Mirnohrad. We just saw Ukrainian drones in action against individual Russian soldiers. The Russians are also still very active, of course, with their elite units when it comes to drones. And now we see attacks here by Rubicon, this special unit with fiber optic guided drones, mainly against vehicles. The Russians aren't so much looking to pick off Ukrainian soldiers one by one because there are just so few Ukrainian soldiers compared to the many Russians who keep pushing forward here. Instead, the Russians' goal is to immobilize them, basically to deny the Ukrainians the chance to move out from their shelters or hideouts in all directions in their cars. That's one thing. But also, as we've seen, many antennas were attacked. Antennas, larger mounted antennas, which are absolutely vital for operating, for instance, the Shark drone or other drones belonging to the Ukrainian army. And time and again, these attacks more and more often lately, specifically on these small robots. We see them here, the robot basically moving along here, in this case empty right now. And we see that it is basically a big cage or a big cart with wheels located underneath, which is able to just move along the front, even single. Armored vehicles are still being attacked. They're still out there at the front, but only in very, very small numbers. That's why most of the Russian videos these days showing civilian vehicles, pickups, or even robotic units, it's the same thing as before. They've been attacked repeatedly from all sorts of different situations. Probably a BMP being attacked right here. All in all, Rubicon remains very active. As mentioned, on the front, it has its drone units, which are fiber optic guided with small batteries. At relatively short ranges, short in this case meaning 20, maybe even 30 kilometers to attack. Beyond that, Russia uses other drones without fiber optic links and not quadcopters either, but fixed-wing aircraft. And these fixed-wing aircraft have been using the Western Starlink system more and more during the course of the last few weeks and months. So it is a system then which comes from SpaceX of Elon Musk and his own respective company as well. And we'll take a look at how Ukrainian units saw this Starlink, how they tracked it down, namely by their own interceptor drones. We see it here, they're Sting-type interceptor drones, I believe in this case, as they flew right up to the Russian drones, in this case a BM-35 Italmas. We see them here, and you can see it pretty well right here. That means the Russians have installed the Starlink system on the wing here, and that gives them the opportunity to use it for a live feed with live internet access, with the ability to control it live the entire time, both the video and the drone's movement, to attack very precisely, even when targeting moving vehicles. And so we see it here again, the approach here, we see it at the last moment, so that's where the Starlink is installed. So the Russians have a massive advantage they've built up there over the last few weeks. And that's why, and this was in the news, there's now a plea for help from Kyiv, a call from the Ministry of Defense, specifically to Elon Musk himself, who said, how can this be? Legally, you are required to shut down Starlink inside of Russia. However, the Russian army in Ukraine is using Starlink. Why? Because Starlink simply hasn't been turned off in Ukraine. We see it here too, another drone, in this case a Molniya drone, clearly visible here again. Relatively innovative of the Russians, what was installed here in front of the vertical stabilizer, namely a Starlink system here as well, an antenna with which the Russians can control this drone live. The solution they found together with Elon Musk and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is, I'd say, very innovative. Specifically, while we see the next drone here, they've basically disabled the ability to use Starlink in Ukraine at over 90 kilometers per hour. So it's really a very clever solution, basically. They keep the option for Starlink to provide internet access for civilians, for millions of people, for example, in Ukraine, who don't have good internet use Starlink. So they maintain the ability to stay connected, to use Starlink as a means of communication, even at the front. Also for the Ukrainian soldiers who use WhatsApp, Signal, Threema, and so on via Starlink, so they can't be wiretapped by the Russians while they're communicating with each other. And at the same time, you're making it impossible for the Russian army to use this system to attack Ukraine. This goes even a little bit further, and in fact, according to their own statements, the Ukrainian army is also using Starlink systems for some of its drones. And that's why this company, SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, has added another exception. They basically said, if these drones are registered through the official brigades of the Ukrainian army, meaning they have a special number or something similar, then they're still allowed to move over 90 kilometers per hour and continue to operate. This means, despite all the criticism that's constantly being voiced about Elon Musk, it's pretty clear here, it's following the current legal situation and clearly states that Starlink can be used in Ukraine, also militarily, but only for Ukraine's side. With this new block, they are currently attempting to make the whole situation even more difficult for the Russians from 90 kilometers per hour on, at least to prevent the actual deployment of such drones. From the east of Ukraine, we're moving to the west of Russia, to the Belgorod region. Here's a new video from the Ukrainian army showing how 27 kilometers behind the front, here we see it, they spotted and destroyed a Buk M2 system. And it is a relatively rare sight these days, one really must say, as a HIMARS system is being used right here, firing its rockets into this wooded area where this Buk M2 is currently hiding. We see the Russians trying to hide the whole thing, but they're being filmed the entire time, presumably by a Shark drone of the Ukrainian army, which is now being used here again 27 kilometers inside Belgorod, across from the city of Vovchansk in Kharkiv at this time. So it can watch everything very closely until the very last moment, and now we see the ammunition here that is being used by the Ukrainian side, and we see right after that that the missiles were hit, so the missiles are exploding and then they just fly off. Here we see it, this uncontrolled rocket launch, we see it right here in this direction. So that means, yes, HIMARS systems will continue to be used with a range here of about 85 kilometers. That means you have to have gotten within about 40 kilometers of the front and also the border. That's quite dangerous in this case. However, it just keeps going, and we see the cooperation, at least in some cases, of rocket artillery and drone reconnaissance continues to work, even inside Russia. Finally, we'll take a look at the humanitarian consequences of Russian aggression. We know, I mentioned it earlier, in Ukraine right now it's down to -30, at least -20 across the whole country. And at the very same time, there is even more footage from this morning from the Telegraph, showing further Russian attacks on the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. This morning, 2 thermal power plants were also reportedly attacked, along with numerous civilian facilities and buildings. Here's a residential tower in Kiev that was hit. That means this alleged ceasefire between Trump and Putin that was agreed upon wasn't respected at all. Or rather, the Russians said it was only for 2 days. Trump said for 2 weeks. Trump also said no attacks on Kiev. The Russians said, no, that's just energy infrastructure. We remember buses and so forth have also been attacked in the last few days. There were many deaths, and not even soldiers, but workers in the mines, that is, miners on the Ukrainian side. That is to say, a fake ceasefire, which perhaps gives a bit of a glimpse into what exactly happens if the Russians actually were to agree to a major ceasefire and peace, as Donald Trump has been claiming for 14 months. We're looking at more attacks from the last few days, not from the time of the ceasefire, but just before, which show us exactly how brutal the Russian attacks are and how targeted they are. Here we see a Russian Molniya kamikaze drone approaching Kharkiv and notably not targeting a military object, but we see it quite clearly now. The drone turns right here towards a residential building and then explodes in a civilian apartment right there in Kharkiv, a city of millions, meaning a targeted attack here on a residential building. And the next one can only be called a targeted attack as well, because a maternity clinic was hit here in Zaporizhzhia, which, by the way, also happened during the ceasefire when Russians said maternity clinics aren't part of the energy infrastructure, so they can keep attacking them. So we see the Russian terror against 39 million Ukrainians who are still living in Ukraine. It continues, it's getting worse. It's the coldest, toughest winter of war since the start of the Russian war, and also the one where Russia exploits this vulnerability, this fragility of the Ukrainian people more than ever before.